I learned what happens when your orders come too late on the 19th day of the 7th month of 847, M41, though I would not understand the lesson for another 3 weeks, and by then, it would be far too late for any of us. The pneumatic tube arrived at my desk with its customary hiss and thunk, a sound I had heard 10,000 times before in my 14 years of service to the Administratum on Tertius Scolum. The brass cylinder was warm to the touch, having traveled through 17 kilometers of pressurized conduits from Sector Command, and when I broke the wax seal unmarked, which should have been my first warning, the scroll inside smelled of promethium and something else I could not identify, something organic and wrong. The orders were simple. Redirect all grain shipments from the southern agrarian provinces to the northern defense installations immediately. Priority, Obsidian. Authorization codes followed, a string of alphanumerics that would take me 2 hours to verify through the labyrinthine cross-reference system we used. The signature block at the bottom belonged to Prefect Major Callus, whose name I recognized from morning briefings I never attended because I was too junior to be invited. The paper itself was standard issue, the kind we used for everything from conscription notices to requisition approvals, 40-weight stock, with the Aquila watermark, visible when held to the light. I remember thinking it was strange that such an order would come to me. I was a secondary logistics coordinator, grade 7, responsible for monitoring agricultural output from exactly 3 districts in the southern hemisphere. My authority extended to approximately 14,000 souls, most of them farmers who would never know my name, and my primary function was to ensure that the monthly grain quotas were met and that the appropriate tithes were forwarded to the planetary governor's reserves. I had never received a priority obsidian directive before. I had never received any directive that came directly from Sector Command. Such things were supposed to filter through at least 4 levels of bureaucracy before reaching someone of my rank, but the authorization codes were there, and the seal had been unbroken, and who was I to question the wisdom of my superiors? I had been trained since childhood in the seminaries of the Administratum, to follow procedure, to trust in the system, to understand that every cog in the great Imperial machine had its purpose even if that purpose was not immediately apparent. I had memorized the dictates of administrative conduct. I had passed my examinations with marks high enough to earn this position, this desk, this small measure of authority over grain shipments and crop rotations. I knew my duty, so I began the verification process. The codes had to be checked against the master registry, which was maintained in a vault 3 floors below my office. Access to the vault required a request form in triplicate, signed by my immediate supervisor and countersigned by the shift coordinator. I filled out the forms using my best calligraphy, the way I had been taught, each letter perfectly formed according to the standard template. My supervisor, a graying man named Hestor who had worked in this building for 32 years, signed without reading them. He signed everything without reading it. I had watched him approve a requisition for 3,000 lasguns that was actually a request for new chairs for the clerks' quarters. The lasguns were delivered. We kept them in storage for 6 months before someone noticed the error. The vault was cold, as it always was, maintained at a constant temperature to preserve the ancient cogitators that hummed and clicked in their brass housings along the walls. The master archivist, a woman whose augmetic eyes whirred and refocused constantly, took my forms and examined them for 11 minutes before accepting them. She disappeared into the stacks, and I waited in the antechamber, breathing the recycled air that smelled of machine oil and old paper and something else, something I would later recognize as the smell of time itself, of centuries compressed into rooms and corridors and endless filing systems. When she returned, she carried a ledger, bound in leather, that had cracked with age. The authorization codes checked out, every single one. The orders were legitimate, issued at 0342 hours that same day from Sector Command, transmitted through proper channels, sealed with the correct sigils. Everything was in order. Everything followed procedure. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt a cold weight settling in my stomach, though I could not have explained why. Perhaps it was the speed of the transmission. Perhaps it was the unusual directness of the routing. Perhaps it was simply that in 14 years of service, I had never seen anything move through the Administratum with such efficiency, and efficiency in an institution built on careful deliberation felt wrong somehow, like a clock ticking backwards or water flowing uphill. But I had my orders, and they were verified, and so I returned to my desk and began the implementation process. Redirecting grain shipments required forms of my own, requisitionary routes and transport manifests and notifications to the receiving warehouses in the north. I had to calculate tonnage and transportation capacity and delivery schedules. I had to account for spoilage rates and convoy security and fuel consumption for the transport vehicles. Each calculation required referencing different manuals. Each manual required retrieving from different filing systems. Each filing system required different access permissions. By the time I had completed the preliminary paperwork, it was well past the second shift change. The office had emptied around me, my colleagues departing for their habitation blocks, their subsidized meals, their brief hours of sanctioned rest before the cycle began again. I worked by the light of my desk lamp, a flickering luminescent tube that cast everything in shades of gray and yellow. Outside my window, the hive city sprawled into the darkness, a million lights marking a million lives, all of them organized, categorized, administered by people like me who filled out forms and verified codes and trusted in the system. I finished the implementation orders 3 hours before dawn. They were perfect. Every box checked, every line filled, every signature in place. I placed them in the outgoing pneumatic tube system, watched them disappear into the conduits with that same hiss and thunk, and went home to my small room in sub-level 6, where I collapsed on my cot without removing my uniform. The next morning, I arrived to find another pneumatic cylinder waiting at my desk. This one was marked with a red stripe, indicating urgency below priority obsidian but above routine communications. Inside was a query from the Southern Agricultural Coordinators, asking for clarification on the redirect order. They had begun receiving my implementation forms overnight, and wanted to confirm that this was not an error. The redirect would leave the southern provinces with insufficient grain reserves for the coming season. They would be operating at 43% of recommended stockpiles. This was within acceptable parameters according to subsection 7.4 of the Agricultural Sufficiency Mandates, but it was not optimal. They were not refusing the order, they simply wanted confirmation. I sent confirmation. The orders were legitimate. I had verified them myself. I included copies of the authorization codes and the signature block from Prefect Major Callus. I marked my response with the appropriate priority classification and sent it through the system, where it would take approximately 6 hours to reach the Southern Agricultural Coordinators through the proper channels. 4 hours later, another cylinder arrived. This one contained a notification from the Northern Defense Installations, acknowledging receipt of the incoming shipment orders. They requested updated delivery schedules and manifests. Standard procedure. I spent the rest of the day preparing those documents, cross-referencing transport capacities with delivery windows, accounting for the fact that the northern provinces were 700 kilometers from the southern agrarian zones, and the roads between them passed through territory that required additional security escorts due to intermittent rebel activity in the eastern foothills. That was when I noticed the first discrepancy. The original orders had specified immediate redirection of all grain shipments, but they had not included provisions for security escorts. This was unusual for priority obsidian directives, which typically accounted for such contingencies. I checked the original scroll again, reading it carefully, and found no mention of security provisions. This meant I would need to file separate requisitions for military escort details, which would require approval from the Departmentum Munitorum, which operated on a different authorization hierarchy than the Administratum, which meant interdepartmental coordination forms, which meant delays. I hesitated. The orders had said immediately, but they had not said how to achieve immediately. They had not provided the mechanisms for immediate action. They had simply assumed those mechanisms would exist, would function, would be ready. This was not how the Administratum worked. Nothing happened immediately in the Administratum. Everything required process, verification, authorization, documentation. Immediate was not a time frame, it was an aspiration, a conceptual state that existed in theory, but not in practice. I filed the security escort requisitions. I marked them priority obsidian, cross-referenced them with the original orders, and sent them through the proper channels to the Departamento Munitorum. According to standard processing times, I could expect a response in 4 to 6 days. In the meantime, the grain shipments would need to be held in staging warehouses, which would require additional requisitions for warehouse space, which would require coordination with the Planetary Logistics Authority, which operated on yet another authorization hierarchy. By the end of the second day, I had generated 47 separate documents related to the original order. Each document had been properly filed, properly routed, properly verified. Everything was proceeding according to procedure. Everything was in order. And yet I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the smooth functioning of the system was somehow failing to achieve its purpose, that all my careful work was accomplishing nothing except the generation of more work. On the third day, I received a personal visit from my supervisor, Hestor. He stood beside my desk, his grey uniform rumpled from what I assumed was a poor night's sleep, and asked me about the grain redirect. He had received queries from several departments, all of them questioning various aspects of the implementation. Were the security provisions in place? Had the northern installations confirmed adequate storage capacity? Had the southern provinces acknowledged the sustainability impact assessments? Each question was valid. Each question required a response. Each response required time I did not have, because I was still working on the foundational implementation. I explained the situation to Hestor. I showed him the original orders, the verification documents, the implementation forms, the subsequent requisitions. He listened without interrupting, his eyes moving across the papers spread across my desk, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I heard the sounds of the office around us, the scratching of styluses on parchment, the clicking of cogitator keys, the hum of the ventilation system pushing recycled air through the building, the distant rumble of the hive city outside, millions of people going about their lives, unaware that their food supply was being rerouted because someone at Sector Command had decided it was necessary. "Did you query the purpose of the redirect?" Hestor asked finally. I stared at him. The question had not occurred to me. "The orders were priority obsidian," I said. "Verified and authorized. I implemented them according to procedure." "But did you ask why?" I had not. It was not my place to ask why. I was a secondary logistics coordinator, grade 7. My function was implementation, not interrogation. The Administratum was built on the principle of distributed responsibility. Those above me made decisions. Those below me executed those decisions. The system worked because everyone understood their role, because no one presumed to do another's job, because the machine functioned when each cog turned in its designated direction at its designated speed. "Should I have?" I asked, and I heard the uncertainty in my own voice. Hestor looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "No, you did what you were supposed to do, but someone should ask, someone higher up, someone who has the authority to question priority obsidian directives." He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to adjust his collar. "I'll send a query upward. Through proper channels. In the meantime, continue the implementation." He left, and I returned to my work, but the question lingered in my mind. Why redirect the grain shipments? The northern defense installations were well supplied, according to all the reports I had access to. The southern provinces were producing at optimal levels. There had been no recent increases in military activity that would require additional provisions. No Imperial Guard regiments had been deployed to the region. No naval vessels had made port in the northern harbors. The redirect seemed to serve no obvious purpose, and yet it had been ordered with the highest priority classification available to planetary administration. I pushed the thought aside. It was not my concern. My concern was implementation, and implementation was proceeding according to procedure. I continued filling out forms, generating documents, routing requests through the appropriate channels. The work consumed me, as it always did, and I found a strange comfort in its familiarity, in the act of converting chaos into order through careful documentation and proper process. On the fourth day, the first convoy departed from the southern agricultural zones. I received confirmation via pneumatic tube at 0847 hours. 12 heavy transport vehicles carrying approximately 240 tons of grain, escorted by a single squad of planetary defense forces. Because the Departamento Munitorum had denied my request for a full security detail on the grounds that the requisition forms had been filled out using an outdated template from 3 years prior. I had not known the template had been updated. No one had informed me. The updated template was stored in a filing system I did not have access to, because it was classified 2 grades above my clearance level. I filed an appeal. The appeal process would take 8 to 10 days. The convoy proceeded without adequate security, because priority obsidian meant immediate, and immediate did not allow for 8 to 10 days of appeals processing. I learned of the attack on the 5th day. The report came through standard channels, filtered through 3 departments before reaching my desk, stripped of urgency by the time it arrived, because the reporting format did not include provisions for immediate threat notification. The convoy had been ambushed in the eastern foothills by rebel forces, exactly as the security assessment had predicted would be a risk. 8 of the 12 vehicles had been destroyed, the other 4 had been captured, 160 tons of grain lost, 11 Defense Force soldiers dead, 3 captured. The report requested guidance on how to proceed with replacement shipments. I read the report 3 times, each time hoping I had misunderstood something, that the words would rearrange themselves into a different configuration that did not include casualties and captured supplies. But the words remained unchanged, cold and precise, formatted according to standard reporting protocols, as if the deaths of 11 soldiers were simply another data point to be documented and filed. I should have felt something, grief, perhaps, or anger, or guilt. Instead, I felt only a numb recognition that this was the natural consequence of the system functioning as designed. The orders had been implemented according to procedure. The security requisitions had been filed through proper channels. The appeals process had been initiated according to regulation. Everything had been done correctly, and yet the outcome was failure, and I could not identify where the failure had occurred because no individual step had been wrong. I prepared the replacement shipment documentation. Standard procedure required replacing lost supplies within a specified time frame, and that time frame was approaching. The Southern Agricultural Coordinators would need to prepare additional convoys. The Departamento Munitorum would need to provide security escorts, this time using the correct template, which I had finally located in the updated filing system after requesting temporary elevated clearance through my supervisor. The northern defense installations would need to adjust their receiving schedules to account for the delay. Each of these actions required additional documentation. Each document required review and approval through multiple levels of authority. The machine was working exactly as it was designed to work, processing information, generating responses, maintaining order through careful adherence to procedure, and people were dying because the machine did not know how to move fast enough to prevent death, only how to document it properly after it occurred. On the 6th day, I received another pneumatic cylinder. This one was marked with both red and black stripes, a combination I had never seen before, indicating something beyond the standard priority classifications. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, containing only a reference number and instructions to attend a meeting at Sector Command at 1400 hours. I arrived at the designated time, having filled out the necessary absence authorization forms and filed them with my supervisor. Sector Command was housed in a tower that rose above the general sprawl of the hive city, its upper levels reserved for officials whose ranks I could only guess at. The security checkpoint at the entrance required 3 separate identity verifications and a full-body scan before I was allowed to proceed. An escort servitor, its human features long ago replaced by mechanical efficiency, guided me through corridors lined with portraits of previous administrators, their painted faces stern and disapproving, watching me pass with dead eyes that seemed to judge my inadequacy. The meeting room was small and windowless, lit by a single flickering luminescent panel that cast everything in harsh white light. There were 5 other people present when I arrived, all of them seated around a steel table worn smooth by decades of use. I recognized none of them, though their uniforms indicated they held ranks significantly higher than my own. A woman at the head of the table gestured for me to sit, and I obeyed, lowering myself into a metal chair that was slightly too small, forcing me to sit at an awkward angle. "You are Secondary Logistics Coordinator Macias Crane, assigned to Southern Agricultural Oversight, Sector 7 Beta 9? The woman asked. Her voice was flat, bureaucratic, drained of inflection. "Yes, ma'am," I said, though I did not know her rank or title, only that she outranked me sufficiently that ma'am seemed appropriate. "You processed a priority obsidian directive 6 days ago regarding grain shipment redirection, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. Authorization verified and implementation completed according to procedure. There was an incident. A convoy was attacked. Supplies were lost." "Yes, ma'am." I filed the incident report and initiated replacement shipment protocols. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she already knew. "The order you processed, did you query its origin?" My supervisor initiated an upward query through proper channels, I said. "I was not involved in that process directly. That query reached my office yesterday," she said. "I am the one who issued the original order." She paused, and in that pause, I felt the weight of something terrible about to be revealed. "I issued it 7 weeks ago." The room seemed to contract around me. 7 weeks. I had received the order 6 days ago. 7 weeks. I tried to do the calculation, to understand what that meant, but my mind was struggling to process the information. "The order was time-sensitive," the woman continued. "It was issued in response to intelligence, indicating rebel forces were planning a major offensive in the northern provinces. We needed to ensure adequate supply for our defense installations before the offensive began. The order was marked Priority Obsidian specifically to expedite its implementation. But I received it 6 days ago," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Yes, because it spent 7 weeks moving through the pneumatic tube system. The routing protocols failed. The cylinder was misrouted through 17 different administrative centers before finally reaching your desk. By the time you received it, the rebel offensive had already begun. The attack on your convoy was part of that offensive. The grain you were trying to redirect was exactly what the rebels needed to sustain their campaign in the foothills." I could not speak, could not think. 7 weeks. The orders had been too late before I ever received them. Everything I had done, every form I had filled out, every requisition I had filed, all of it had been in service of a goal that no longer existed, a strategic necessity that had already been overtaken by events. The machine had failed, not because anyone had done anything wrong, but because the machine was too slow, too cumbersome, too bound by its own procedures to respond to a reality that moved faster than paperwork could travel. "The offensive has been ongoing for 6 weeks, the woman said. "We have lost control of the eastern foothills. The rebel forces have captured 3 agricultural centers. They are using the grain supplies to feed their armies. Your convoy was the 4th supply shipment they have intercepted. Each one reached them because we were trying to redirect it according to orders that should have been implemented 2 months ago." "Why wasn't I informed?" I asked, and immediately regretted the question because I already knew the answer. Because the information about the routing failure only came to light when your supervisor's query reached me, she said. No one realized the original order had been delayed. It disappeared into the pneumatic system, and the system does not have a mechanism for tracking individual cylinders. We only found it because we traced the authorization codes backward through 17 administrative centers, each one documenting that they had received the cylinder and forwarded it according to their understanding of proper routing protocols. Every single center followed procedure correctly, and every single center forwarded it to the wrong destination because the routing tables they were using were out of date. Out of date, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. Updated routing protocols were issued 4 months ago, she said. They were distributed through the standard notification system. But the standard notification system is backed up by approximately 6 months due to staffing shortages in the Departamento Comunicatus. Most administrative centers are still operating on protocols that were deprecated last year. Your orders were routed according to deprecated protocols, which is why they took 7 weeks to reach you instead of 7 hours. I sat in silence, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the failure. Not a failure of individuals, but a failure of the system itself, a failure so massive and so distributed across so many departments and so many levels of bureaucracy that no single person could be held responsible because everyone had been following procedure. The machine had defeated itself through its own complexity, through its own insistence on proper process, through its own inability to adapt faster than events moved. What happens now? I asked. The woman looked at me with something that might have been pity, though it was difficult to read emotion in her exhausted face. You continue your work. The northern defense installations still need supplies. The southern provinces still need to meet their quotas. The war continues. We continue. There is nothing else to do. But the orders came too late. Yes. People died because of that. Yes. And there's no way to fix it. No way to make the system work faster. The system works as it was designed to work, she said. It processes information, maintains order, ensures that every action is properly documented and authorized. Speed was never a design priority. Accuracy was. Accountability was. We can trace every decision back through every level of authority. We can document exactly how and why things happened. We simply cannot make them happen fast enough to matter. I left the meeting in a daze, guided back through the corridors by the same servitor, processed out through the same security checkpoints, released back into the hive city where millions of people continued their lives, unaware that the systems protecting them were too slow to actually protect them, could only document their deaths after they occurred. I returned to my desk. There were new pneumatic cylinders waiting. More orders, more requisitions, more reports. I opened them one by one, read them carefully, verified the authorization codes, and began the implementation process. I did my job. I followed procedure. I maintained order. On the 7th day, I received confirmation that the second replacement convoy had been prepared and was ready for departure. The security escort had been approved, using the correct template this time, and a full platoon of planetary defense forces would be accompanying the shipment. Everything was in order. Everything followed procedure. The convoy would depart at dawn on the 8th day. That night, I could not sleep. I lay on my cot in my small room, listening to the sounds of the hive city through the thin walls, the distant rumble of machinery, the occasional shout from the corridors, the endless background hum of ventilation systems and power generators, and all the mechanical systems that kept 6 million people alive in this vertical prison we called civilization. I thought about the orders that had come too late, about the 7 weeks they had spent traveling through pneumatic tubes while men died in the foothills, about the rebel forces who were now using Imperial grain to feed their armies, because the machine that was supposed to prevent that was too slow to do anything except document that it had happened. I thought about the woman at Sector Command, about how tired she had looked, about how she had delivered the information about the routing failure with the same flat bureaucratic tone she would use to discuss crop yields or equipment requisitions. This was not unusual to her. This was simply how the system worked, how it had always worked, how it would continue to work long after both of us were dead and forgotten, replaced by other functionaries who would sit at our desks and process our requisitions and implement our orders, all of us interchangeable parts in a machine too vast to comprehend and too established to change. The second convoy departed at dawn, as scheduled. I received confirmation via pneumatic tube at 0647 hours. 18 heavy transport vehicles carrying 300 tons of grain, escorted by 37 planetary defense soldiers, proceeding along the approved route with expected arrival at the northern defense installations in 4 days. I received the attack report at 1523 hours that same afternoon. The convoy had been ambushed less than 100 kilometers from its departure point. The rebels had known exactly where it would be, exactly when it would pass through the most vulnerable section of the route, exactly how many vehicles and how many escorts. They had prepared accordingly. 16 vehicles destroyed, 2 captured, 240 tons of grain lost, 31 soldiers dead, 4 wounded, 2 captured. The report requested guidance on how to proceed with additional replacement shipments. I stared at the report for a long time, reading it over and over, as if repetition would somehow change the outcome. But the words remained constant, immutable, final: more deaths, more losses, more failures of a system that worked perfectly according to its own internal logic, but failed utterly to achieve its actual purpose. I began to understand something then, something terrible and inescapable. The orders had not come too late by accident. They had come too late by design. Not intentional design, not malicious design, but design nonetheless. The Administratum was built to be slow, to be deliberate, to ensure that every action was properly documented and properly authorized and properly routed through proper channels. This was not a flaw in the system. This was the system. Speed would introduce chaos. Speed would create errors. Speed would undermine the careful hierarchies and procedures that kept the Imperium functioning across 1,000,000 worlds. Better that some convoys be destroyed than that the entire administrative structure collapse into uncontrolled haste. Better that some soldiers die than that orders be issued without proper verification. Better that some provinces starve than that the sacred chain of authority be compromised by shortcuts and expedient decisions made without proper documentation. The machine valued its own continuation above the lives of those it was supposed to serve, and people like me, people who processed the orders and filed the forms and maintained the system, we were not serving the Imperium. We were serving the machine that claimed to serve the Imperium, and those were not the same thing at all. I did not file the replacement shipment documentation that day. Instead, I sat at my desk and stared at the blank forms, the carefully designed templates with their designated fields and their specific formatting requirements and their elaborate authorization hierarchies. I thought about how many hours of collective human effort had gone into designing these forms, how many committees had met to debate the proper placement of signature lines, how many memoranda had been drafted to specify exactly which information belonged in which fields and which officials had authority to approve which sections. All of that effort, all of that careful work, all of it in service of a system that could not save 31 soldiers from dying because their supply convoy had been ordered 7 weeks too late. On the 8th day, I received a direct summons to my supervisor's office. Hestor was standing when I entered, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out the single small window that looked out over the hive city's lower levels. He did not turn when I closed the door. "You did not file the replacement shipment documentation," he said. "No, sir." "Why not?" I hesitated. How could I explain what I had realized? How could I put into words the slow horror of understanding that everything we did was futile, that the system we served was incapable of moving fast enough to matter, that our careful procedures were killing people through their own meticulous thoroughness? "The orders came too late," I said finally. "They will always come too late. The rebels know our routes. They know our schedules. They know exactly where to hit us because we document everything, and our documentation is captured every time they take a convoy. Every form I fill out is intelligence for our enemies. Every procedure we follow is a predictability they can exploit. We cannot win this way. No, Hestor said quietly. We cannot. He turned to face me then, and I saw in his eyes a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion, a spiritual fatigue that came from decades of service to a system he no longer believed in but could not escape. But we continue anyway, he said, because the alternative is chaos, because without the Administratum, without the procedures and the documentation and the proper channels, the Imperium would collapse. 1,000,000 worlds would descend into anarchy. Billions would die. The system is slow, yes. The system fails, yes. But it fails less catastrophically than no system at all. Is that supposed to comfort me? I asked. That our failures are less terrible than theoretical failures that might occur if we did things differently. No, Hestor said. It is not supposed to comfort you. It is simply the truth. We are not here to be comforted. We are here to serve. Even when our service accomplishes nothing, especially then. He returned to his desk and retrieved a form from a drawer. I recognized it immediately, a efficiency citation, the standard disciplinary action for failure to complete assigned tasks within designated timeframes. I am required to document your failure to file the replacement shipment documentation, Hestor said, signing the form with practice strokes. You will have this notation in your permanent record. It will affect your future advancement opportunities. This is procedure. He held out the form, and I took it, feeling the weight of it in my hands. This piece of paper, that would follow me for the rest of my career, a permanent mark of the day I had failed to properly serve the machine. File the documentation, Hestor said. Do your job. There is nothing else. I returned to my desk. I filled out the forms. I processed the requisitions. I did my job. The third convoy departed on the 9th day. It was ambushed on the 10th day. 22 soldiers died. 180 tons of grain was lost. The fourth convoy departed on the 14th day. It was ambushed on the 15th day. 17 soldiers died. 200 tons of grain was lost. The fifth convoy departed on the 19th day. It reached the northern defense installations without incident on the 23rd day, delivering 80 tons of grain, less than half of what had been originally planned, because the other shipments had been destroyed or captured. I received a commendation for the successful delivery. The commendation was signed by someone at Sector Command, whose name I did not recognize. It praised my efficient processing of complicated logistics under difficult circumstances. It noted my exemplary adherence to proper procedures. It recommended me for advancement to Primary Logistics Coordinator, Grade V, pending the completion of additional training courses and the filing of appropriate promotion request documentation. I placed the commendation in my filing cabinet, next to the efficiency citation I had received for failing to file documentation quickly enough, and I understood that these two documents, one praising me, one disciplining me, were equally meaningless, equally part of the machine's endless process of documentation that served no purpose except to document itself. On the 21st day, I received another pneumatic cylinder from Sector Command. Inside was a new order, marked Priority Obsidian, signed by the same woman who had told me about the routing failure. The order directed me to redirect all remaining grain shipments from the southern agricultural zones back to local storage. The northern defense installations no longer required additional supplies. The rebel offensive had succeeded. The northern provinces had been abandoned by Imperial forces. Evacuations were underway. The grain I had spent 3 weeks trying to redirect was no longer needed because there was no one left to feed. The order had been issued that morning. It had reached my desk within 6 hours. The routing protocols had been updated. The system had been fixed. Too late for 70 soldiers who had died escorting convoys that should never have been sent. Too late for the 3 agricultural centers that had fallen to rebel forces. Too late for the northern provinces that were now under enemy control. But the system was working again, efficiently routing orders through proper channels at proper speeds, ready to fail the next crisis with renewed vigor. I read the order 3 times. Then I began the implementation process, filling out the necessary forms, filing the required documentation, processing everything according to proper procedure. I did my job. I served the machine. There was nothing else. That night, I returned to my small room and lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the mechanical heartbeat of the hive city around me. I thought about the pneumatic cylinders that traveled through kilometers of conduits, carrying orders that might arrive in hours or weeks or months, depending on routing failures no one could predict or prevent. I thought about the convoys rolling through the foothills, following routes that had been properly planned and properly documented and properly approved, rolling toward ambush points that our enemies had identified because our procedures made us predictable. I thought about the soldiers who had died following orders that had come too late to save them, and I thought about the administrators who had issued those orders and the coordinators like me who had implemented them and the system that had processed them all according to proper procedure. I thought about the woman at Sector Command, telling me that the system worked as it was designed to work. I thought about Hestor, explaining that our failures were less terrible than the theoretical failures of having no system at all. I thought about all of us, millions of functionaries across a million worlds, all of us filling out forms and verifying codes and routing documents through proper channels, all of us maintaining the great machine of the Administratum, all of us serving faithfully and diligently and utterly failing to protect anyone, because the machine was too slow, too rigid, too committed to its own procedures, to adapt to reality. And I understood, finally, what happens when your orders come too late. Nothing happens. The system continues. The forms are filled out. The procedures are followed. The documentation is filed. The machine processes the failure and generates new orders and new forms and new procedures, and somewhere in some distant future those orders will arrive too late as well, and more people will die, and more documentation will be generated, and the machine will continue turning because that is what machines do, indifferent to the lives ground beneath their gears, perfect in their operation, and catastrophic in their effect. I learned what happens when your orders come too late on the 19th day of the 7th month of 847, M41, and the lesson was this: everything continues exactly as it was before, because the system cannot afford to admit that it is the problem. The orders were issued. The orders were verified. The orders were implemented. Everything followed proper procedure. That the outcome was failure is irrelevant. That people died is irrelevant. What matters is that the documentation is correct, that the authorizations are valid, that the forms are properly filled out and properly filed. What matters is that the machine keeps turning. I am still at my desk. I'm still a secondary logistics coordinator, grade 7. Though my promotion to grade 6 is pending, I still receive pneumatic cylinders filled with orders that may be hours old or weeks old or months old, and I still verify them and implement them according to proper procedure. I still do my job. The northern provinces have not been recovered. The rebel forces have consolidated their control and are using the captured grain supplies to sustain their occupation. New orders have been issued to redirect grain shipments to different defense installations in other regions, anticipating other offensives, trying to stay ahead of enemies who move faster than our pneumatic tubes can travel. I process those orders when they arrive. I file the documentation. I verify the codes. I do my job. And I wait for the next cylinder to arrive, carrying the next orders, which may come in time or may come too late. And either way I will implement them according to procedure, because that is what the machine requires, and I am a cog in the machine, and cogs do not question, do not hesitate, do not refuse to turn. They simply turn, grinding forward, indifferent to the lives crushed beneath them, perfect in their function and catastrophic in their effect. This is what happens when your orders come too late. This is what happens every day in the Imperium of Man, across a million worlds, in 10,000 administrative centers, to billions of souls who trust that the system will protect them. The system documents their deaths instead. and the machine continues turning. Always.